David, welcome to the show. Is it time to give the BBC a pay rise?
Good evening. No, I don't think it is, because I don't think that the events with Gary Lineker and over impartiality generally show that the BBC hasn't got its act in order. They have stuck resolutely to the idea that they should be funded by the licence fee when the broadcast environment is changing massively. And in that sense, they are asking for trouble, because people are asking the question against this lack of impartiality and various falling viewing figures, etc. They're asking the question of whether they want to pay the licence fee. Evasion's up to 10%, and at the same time, nearly 2,000 people a week are being fined for non-payment. It's a very difficult situation.
However, John Sargent, is this fair on the BBC? It's watched and listened to by millions.
That's right. More than 90% of the population listen and watch the BBC every week. The idea that you could introduce quick changes or that you can bleed the BBC to death by 1,000 cuts, you've got to be very careful with this. It's a very elaborate balance between making sure that enough people pay and there's enough money to make sure that it's not too expensive. Now, you may think £159 a year is a lot of money, but actually it's only about 40 pence a day. And if you change that system, it's going to end up, if you're not very careful, you say, oh, why can't it be like Netflix, or why can't it be like other things? You may find the subscription, if it is a subscription, is much more than 40 pence a day. So whatever you do, you've got to do with great care. And it's interesting that although the government have said we're going to review the licence fee, and they promised to do that a year ago, what's actually happened is that they still think this is a very tricky issue. And remember, there is an election next year. If they're going to change the BBC finance system, it'll have to be in the manifesto.
However, David Keithley, you look at podcasts now. I mean, the most downloaded and listened to podcast in the world is the Joe Rogan podcast. This is a guy that essentially hosts a show in his garage. He's got one producer and 11 million listeners a week. The BBC ought to cut its cloth, don't you think? Particularly given that other broadcasters, dare I say it, including GBNews, do just that.
Exactly. And that's my point about the broadcasting environment changing rapidly. And to answer what John Sargent said, I'm not talking about bleeding the BBC to death by 1,000 cuts. They're very lavishly funded at the moment, with income of over £3.5 billion a year. What's necessary here is, in the midterm review that the DCMS is releasing in May, that work on that is underway, and Nadine Dorries was Culture Secretary when that process was set in chain. What they need to be doing is looking at the issue very carefully and looking at how they can maintain the good points of the BBC while at the same time reforming it to meet the requirements of the new broadcasting environment, and at a cost that people can afford. £159 to £173 a year, £172 a year is a huge increase for people on very low incomes. John might talk about only 40 pence per day, but if you're a single mother, and most of the people who are fined for non-payment of fines are in that category, that is a lot of money. And that should be taken into account when there are alternative means of broadcasting these days.